Uh, Is learning health system activity research or quality improvement? If anybody knows the answer to that question, you can stand up and give the lecture, because Nancy will gladly yield the podium to you. Seriously, Nancy's work and much of what she's going to talk about goes right to that extremely important issue. Nancy has a lot of jobs at Johns Hopkins. She's the vice provost for graduate and professional education. She's the Phoebe R. Berman Professor of Bioethics and Public Health in the Berman Institute of Bioethics at the School of Public Health, and she's also a professor of health policy and management, and you probably do a few other things too that are not written down here, and you can tell us about them if you want. Nancy has written extensively on ethics issues and extensively on these issues as they relate to learning health systems. She will be speaking with us today on the topic of ethics for a learning healthcare system, the Common Purpose Framework. Nancy, we're delighted to have you here, and welcome. Yeah, if you want to wander around. Absolutely.
Okay. Is it on? No. I can hold it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chuck. It is lovely to be here. And at 5:30 this morning, when I was scraping the ice off my car, I didn't know if I was going to make it. And I'm really glad I did. And I'm so thrilled that all of you have made it as well. So thank you for coming out in the cold. I also just want to give a personal shout out to my friend and colleague, Duke Morrow, who's here also. We do work together. Only a little bit related to this, I also chair the National All of Us Research Program, Precision Medicine, IRB, and Duke is a member of the IRB, so thanks for coming out. As Chuck said, I want to talk about some work that a group of colleagues and I did and put together. There's a small piece at the end that has sort of come since we did the main body of work, but the majority of this talk is going to be related to work that I did with this spectacular group of colleagues and friends. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about these people because to me it's relevant to the project that we were doing and where we landed. So Ruth Faden and I are ethics faculty at Johns Hopkins. Ruth was the founder of our Bioethics Institute. Those are the backgrounds we bring. We're both social scientists who've done a lot of work on ethics and human research. And as a matter of fact, Ruth wrote a textbook that I used as a graduate student on informed consent, which is not entirely irrelevant to sort of where we're going. Tom Beecham, who's the third photograph there, is now professor emeritus at Georgetown, but he was one of the drafters of the Belmont Report. I imagine most of you know about the Belmont Report. It not only got us these principles of beneficence, respect, and justice, but it helped to coin the definition that I'm going to refer to in a minute that helps us distinguish research that needs to be reviewed by an IRB from practice that does not need to be reviewed from an IRB. And so it was really spectacular having Tom as part of this. Sean Tunis is a comparative effectiveness research person. Peter Pronovost, some of you, has a lot of relationship with Michigan. At the time we did the project, was a professor at Johns Hopkins and is sort of our quality patient safety guru. And Steve Goodman, who also at the time was at Hopkins, now is vice dean at Stanford, is a clinical trials expert with also ethics thinking. So this is a project we did that was very mindful of importance of having people who understand clinical trials, understand research, understand patient safety and quality, et cetera. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how have we thought about ethical oversight when we learn historically, and what are the problems with that? And let me be clear that I have spent much of my professional life thinking about working on getting grants for teaching research ethics. I really believe in the commitments of research ethics, but there are now, I will claim, there are some challenges with the particulars in the definitions and the systems that were set up about 50 years ago. And then what might an ethics framework look like for learning healthcare, which I really believe, and I'll talk about more, is a very important ethical good for our world. So, so how did we get to where we are with the US federal regulations that were passed in the 1970s? So this is just a little reminder. This is like American Research Ethics History 101. I'm going to go through this quickly, but I think the history is important because what we have came out of an important set of realizations in our history that led to a really transformative step forward of having human subjects regulations for the first time. So in the 1960s and 70s, a variety of research scandals came to public awareness, the most dramatic of which was the Tuskegee syphilis study, which had gone on for 40 years in our country and was conducted by our government on its own citizens. In 1974, in response most directly to Tuskegee, but then there were a variety of other scandals that had been either funded by our government or, like Tuskegee, actually conducted by our government on its own people. In 1974, we got our human subjects regulations essentially as we know them today that were passed. And given the history out of which they emerged, which was a history that was very concerned with a lot of vulnerable people being targeted for research. Essentially, we can learn on these convenient samples who might not ask a lot of questions. There's a very strong emphasis on protection. Research is really important, but we need to make sure that people are protected from what could be the zeal of scientists to ignore the humanity of the people who are enrolled. And a big piece of the protection, in addition to outlining the sort of foundational ethical principles that underlie the protections, the practical component was that something called an IRB, Institutional Review Board, had to be created at essentially every institution across the country that gets federal funding for human research, in order to look at that research before the scientists can have any contact with the human beings who might be involved, to make sure that the benefits outweigh the risks, that we do inform consent, that people are fairly recruited, et cetera. Whoops, oh goodness, this, how do I get this back? Let's see here, sorry. One of the things that happens when you pass regulations of any sort, obviously, is you need to define the body of activity to which those regulations apply. If we're going to say you need to have IRB oversights, like, okay, so what kinds of interactions with human beings require IRB oversight? We, the science world, and certainly doctors and nurses, do an enormous amount of interaction with human beings or their data. So what are we talking about? So the regulations had to be able to distinguish clinical research from clinical care. This slide has what our group called two pieces of the definition that distinguishes research that needs IRB oversight from activities that don't need IRB oversight, two pieces of the definition that exist in those federal regulations, and three more that since that time are claims that are consistently made in the literature that sort of go along with these or that help to justify them ethically. So again, this is sort of where we have been. So the first piece of the regulatory definition, and my guess is most of you in the room could recite this by heart, is that research is intended to produce generalizable knowledge, right? This is, and again, get yourself back in the mindset of the 1970s or try to imagine what it was like. There were many, many, many fewer clinical trials. There were certainly not electronic medical records. There were not the big databases that people talk about. Patient files were essentially paper folders. And so research was that set of activities that were systematically collecting data in order to produce this thing called generalizable knowledge. And the assumption then was that this was contrasted with practice where there was a lot of data collection, but that was one-on-one patient data collection, not systematic data collection. And the intent of practice is to help the patient in front of me, whereas again, research is sort of to do generalizable knowledge, to produce knowledge that will help people in the future. The additional claims that are sort of related to this conceptually that are then made over and over in the literature are threefold. First, research, in part because it is intended to help future patients and learn things for the future, has its eye on the future prize and is at risk of potentially doing harm to the people in front of us in order to learn that future knowledge. So one of the reasons we need protection, so unlike in clinical care where the assumption of people are acting with integrity is that a doctor who does his or her best for the patient in front of them will be, whether or not harm actually happens, their goal is to do their best for the patient in front of them. If I want to ask you to be involved in things to help other people, there could conceptually be more risk of the chance that I wouldn't always have your best interests in mind as I pursue my goal of generalizable future knowledge. Research also can pose burdens from activities that are not necessary for good care. I might ask you to do extra blood draws or extra questionnaires or something like that that contribute to my systematic learning, to the learning process for future people. Whereas, again, by contrast, implicitly, the assumption is in clinical care, the tests and questionnaires and visits that I ask you to do are only, we know, for your well-being. And then the last assumption is that research is where there are protocols that determine the care you receive, whereas in clinical care, it is the judgment of your wise physician that determines the care that you receive. Now, I'm not going to go into this in a couple papers we published. We go into a fairly lengthy refuting of the way that these work, both in research and care. I think we all understand why people got to these claims. They make tons of sense conceptually, tons of sense. It turns out in real life that they are not actually true. They are not true universally, let's put it that way. There are certainly plenty of examples where care and research happens through a protocol and care in practice is individually determined. But there are so many examples where care in practice happens through a protocol, whether it's through your health system or through your insurance. You know, through my insurance, I'm told I can get an eye exam every 2 years. If I want one more often than that, I guess I can get it, but I pay for it. So de facto, I get it every 2 years. That's sort of a really benign little example. But which meds I get, there's all sorts of things that become protocolized. And as a matter of fact, for the champions of evidence-based medicine, there's a real goal to try to make certain kinds of practices far more protocolized because the evidence shows how much better that can be for quality and outcomes. So our claim in this project is that relying on this distinction, relying on being able to say when there's systematic data collection with a goal of helping people in the future, we need ethical oversight, and otherwise we don't, is probably no longer going to be the right way to figure out where and when and what kind of ethical oversight ought to be built into a system that is collecting data, both to help the patients who come in for needed care and to learn always from that care going forward. And let me also be sure to reiterate, and I will say this a few times, I said it at the beginning, our challenging this claim was not in any way saying learning is so important that ethics can be put in the trash. We very, very deeply believe in the commitments of being respectful to people, making sure that people are not harmed, certainly through learning or through care, and that the world is fair and is not targeting vulnerable people in ways that are really inappropriate. Our claim is that using that definition to determine when you need the ethics microscope and when you don't is no longer going to work. So as it said, we sort of said there are conceptual, practical, and moral problems with this. So let me tell you what I mean by these sort of three sets of words and why we use them a little differently. Conceptually, so you know, in a nerdy way, a concept is sort of like a definition, right? So there's a concept for what is a table and what is a chair, and I ought to be able to say, aha, a table is this thing that's flat and you can put things on it and it has X numbers of legs, and that's different from a chair, which is this. And so what we're saying is that definition, the systematic collection of data for generalizable knowledge, is no longer able to literally distinguish what is a learning activity from what is regular care. We generalize from, at least again for the purposes of IRB review, we generalize from practice all the time. And indeed, it is a requirement that hospitals engage in quality improvement, which is, by the way, completely exempt from IRB review, if you can sort of tell the difference. And yet that is entirely, particularly if it's done in a good, rigorous way, systematic data improvement for generalizable knowledge for the future. We collect data systematically in practice all the time. And again, people are striving to have more systematic data collection in regular clinical care. There are so many avoidable risks and harms in practice. There are so many unnecessary burdens in practice. I was chatting with somebody when we were getting our lunch plates about sort of duplicative tests that happen for all sorts of pretty silly reasons. And, you know, I can think of several anecdotes in my own family, and I imagine most of you can too, when tests are ordered unnecessarily, when tests were ordered, again, because they either didn't trust the result from the first place or they couldn't get the records because it wasn't interoperable. So this idea that you are only getting care visits tests in clinical care when it is necessary, whereas you might be exposed to an extra one in a research or learning thing is, again, it's just, is not defensible. And there are also more and more research designs that are in no way compromising the quality of care, that are very mindful of what a patient's medical needs are and are trying to meet those medical needs and are continuing to learn from it so that there isn't something in that sort of experimental way. So those are the conceptual problems. The practical problems, again, remember that the whole point of having those definitions was to be able to inform the target audience, people like us, of which kinds of activities needed to go to an IRB and which ones didn't. And while in certain ways over all these decades of practice, yes, experienced IRB offices have become pretty good at advising the people in their community, yes, do send that project, but don't send others. We all know that there is a very large gray area where you ask 5 people and they'll say, yeah, I think you should probably send it to the IRB, and no, you really don't have to. And OHRP investigations have been related to the disagreement. Again, remember that Peter, how many of you know about like Peter Pronovost and the whole Michigan checklist story? So some of you, not too many. I'm not going to go deeply into it, but our colleague, Peter Pronovost, who again used to be at Hopkins, had done a big project here in Michigan that involved, I think, all or almost all of the Michigan hospitals. It was using an intervention that he had tried on this really small scale to do at Hopkins, which was doing a lot of culture change in the ICUs that ultimately then led to a checklist of 5 practices that should be put in place when a central line catheter is going to be inserted, and it turns out it just drastically reduces the likelihood of a bloodline infection, which is a life or death kind of infection. It got published in the New England Journal, and then OHRP ultimately was investigating it because they said that the fact that our Hopkins IRB had said that Peter didn't need to get consent from all of the individual people was a violation, and they didn't think that our IRB should have allowed that. So, this was someone who at least had done his best to go to an IRB for their judgment. It was an IRB that thought of itself as very experienced with these kinds of things. The point being, the definitions that exist are not entirely doing their job. A piece of this project included our getting together people who do a lot of this kind of work as focus groups and asking them if they have had challenges. So here, these are just a few selected quotes from the focus groups. Example. So one person said, we introduced an electronic medical record system where this person works for medication ordering. So we want to study that. So we're going to look at medication errors after we implement our system and compare it with our historical data. We're not the only ones who use this system. And while there could be a risk, you're certainly not getting consent. You're not randomizing people. You're just implementing a new medication system that's going to apply to everybody. And then we'd like to publish it and make it widely known. Really typical example. And again, months negotiating whether it needed to go to the IRB. Here's another one. We've been involved in a couple of QI projects that go into implementation of research. You're beginning with some practice that apparently has good evidence. And then we want to try to understand the barriers to adoption of best practice. Someone's always said, this is evidence-based practice. You go to your own clinical area and they're not doing it. You want to study why is it that they're not doing best practice. And we want to understand the barriers to adoption of best practice. And in doing so, I presume we're disrupting current practice, bad as it might be. And the question is, by changing something toward evidence base from what the patients would have received, does that now become research? And then this, I have to say, became my all-time favorite quote. Our patient safety group is funded out of a medical care budget at home institution. The institution has a separate research budget. So we never have to call anything we do research. So we never call it research. We have like research centers, but we call them centers of inquiry. If we send out a form for people to fill out, we call it a questionnaire, not a survey, because a survey has a certain feel of epidemiology to it. A questionnaire doesn't, you know. Here we are. This is like welcome to my world, right? So then, you know, as I said, our group said we think there's conceptual problems, practical problems, and now I'll sort of get to, you know, my world is ethics, the moral problems. And again, I'll say, like for the umpteenth time, the goal of these protections is to think through the welfare of the human beings involved. And there are welfare interests on what I will call both sides of this equation. We absolutely have a responsibility to make sure that people are not harmed as we learn, but there's also a pretty important responsibility to make sure that we learn so that we reduce what we don't know, not to mention the harms of ongoing clinical practice. And I actually don't think we need to do an either-or trade-off. I really believe we can get to a complete win-win. But I also would argue that there is considerably more harm from all the things clinically we don't know or that are done wrong than there are from things like whether or not you get consent when someone is implementing a best practice. So we have gone on to say that, again, our oversight system is in place to ensure ethical protection for patients who need it. But does our current approach do that appropriately? And we have said we think that the current approach both has pretty significant overprotection and underprotection. So overprotection comes from this really extraordinary apparatus that is in place through the IRB system and the number of human hours devoted to looking at some numbers of pretty low risk protocols, not to mention what then might be if there is a view that individual written informed consent is required, pages of documentation, a lot of time in that process for what a lot of people might genuinely agree is a very, very low risk enterprise. Routine collection of records, comparison of approved widely used therapies, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, if we step back from sort of what's the goal of an IRB system to what's the goal of ethics thinking and oversight in this system, in the healthcare system where sort of we are the powerful, we are the stewards, we want to make sure that every human being who walks through our doors is not exposed to risk that's avoidable, that we minimize uncertainty in clinical care, that we evaluate what we're doing and figure out whether it's working or not, that we put best practices into place, that we evaluate interventions that have never been evaluated, and absolutely that as we learn this, we do this in partnership, with engagement, with acknowledgement, but that we don't ever lose sight of the underprotection that happens by our inability to learn or by our putting up barriers to learning or barriers to learning rigorously. There are, I didn't show quotes, excuse me, from our focus groups where we asked people whether the infrastructure and requirements of the IRB system ever led them to abandon a project or to change the way they were doing a project. And I don't want to say there was this like resounding everybody said yes, but there were several people who had examples of doing something on a much smaller scale, not doing it as rigorously, because putting in the more rigorous methods would have sort of become the tipping point for feeling like they needed to go through an IRB system or potentially get consent in a way that would have just made it not worth it, too slow, too complicated. So, stated differently, we have a current system that examines risks to patients only when we say we're doing research in any kind of ongoing systematic way. But in a US healthcare system where we spend $700 billion to $1 trillion each year on care that is given either in error or unnecessarily, right? Estimates are about 1/3 of the healthcare given is in error or unnecessary or was preventable. It's an extraordinary figure in a country like ours. Are we also considering threats to patients' interests by creating barriers to learning? And should we consider a shift of balance a bit? So we sort of then took, I will say that when we wrote the NIH grant that funded this work, what we thought we were doing and where we ended up, what we thought we were going to do and where we ended up was a little bit different. We said we wanted to take on the ethics of the gray zone. We knew there was the gray zone. We knew it was tripping people up. And we knew that it included in patient safety projects, which is why we included Peter in comparative effectiveness research, et cetera. Where we ended up with this idea of integrated system in learning healthcare there were no such words in our grant proposal. We really were thinking we wanted the gray zone, and where we landed was integration is the answer. So what would the goals of an ethical framework for a learning healthcare system be? Where we finally landed was integration is the key. In utopia, there is a system in which every patient encounter becomes part of a database from which we learn, and that learning is used to improve the care so that every patient who walks through next year gets a little bit better care than the patients who walked through last year. So what would the ethics of that kind of system look like? So we said the goals would be to increase the likelihood that continuous learning occurs. Learning what works in healthcare and what doesn't is an ethical good. Again, if you think of the really significant proportion of healthcare that is delivered in error, unnecessary, duplicative, preventable, et cetera. So learning what works in healthcare and what doesn't is an ethical good. We need to think about a way to make that happen because it's essentially such moral omission for us not to devote more attention to that. And not only through sort of the rarefied occasional clinical trial that's only really a subset of the healthcare universe will commit the time and resources to write. And then also to ensure that if we have that, what I will call utopian vision, that the learning will proceed in an ethically acceptable fashion. Again, I do not in any way mean to suggest that the learning is so important it comes at the expense of ethics. It's how do we just, again, build that into the DNA of the system, into the culture of the system, into the outlook of everybody who works there. We are simultaneously committed to your well-being in the clinical care you receive from your doctor, in the way we protect your data, and part of the reciprocity, part of the compact we make with you is that we're going to learn from what happens in your care. And quite honestly, and we'll get to this, for some of the ways we learn, you don't really have a choice of that. The same way we don't give people a choice with quality improvement. For certain things, we would give people a choice. And part of what we give you in response to that is way better quality care. And every year it gets better. But ensuring that participants' rights, health, and interests must be appropriately protected, both when we provide the care and when we learn from their care. We're saying that this framework that we came up with applies to institutions who deliver care and also are engaged in systematically learning to improve the quality, value, fairness, or efficiency of healthcare system or institutions, where learning activities involve care delivery, system organization, or the use of individual health information, whether it's data only or with human interaction. Traditionally, these things might be labeled clinical research, systems research, quality improvement, all sorts of data bank analysis, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to now share some of the components of the framework. This was a paper we published in the Hastings Center report several years ago. There is one, particularly my colleague Ruth Faden and I have done some work that's followed up from this that I'm going to end with at the end of this, but I also want to tell you that that work has led us to add one additional obligation. So I don't expect that you've read this paper, but the paper itself had 7 obligations. I'm going to present 8. And some of these are going to look familiar in Mom and Apple Pie and ethics. I'm going to explain them a little bit further. So we said a learning healthcare system, again, imagine this integrated system, should respect the rights and dignity of the patients and families that it serves, should respect the judgment of clinicians, should provide each patient with optimal clinical care as best known at the time, should avoid imposing non-clinical risks and burdens. And I'm going to stop right there for a minute, interrupt my flow to say, part of where we then go is to say, and to the extent that you know going into an activity you're doing, a learning activity, that it might compromise these a little bit, that it does provide extra burdens, that you are testing what is known to be the best clinical care against something else where it's experimental, where there's uncertainty, those are triggers for more ethical oversight and more conversation with the patient. So sort of the default assumption and requirement is all of these things are happening. If you're doing something that you think actually could compromise one of the 4, and there will be learning activities that compromise this, we know that, those are part of the triage for where then there needs to be a bit more pause, maybe some external review, maybe some consent, et cetera, et cetera. Another commitment we believe of an ethically sound learning healthcare system is that it is mindful of unjust health inequalities. And that's not something in a formal way that is part of our federal regulations. Our federal regulations talk about justice in one way, which is a very important way, which is making sure that we're not targeting vulnerable populations for research that could be particularly risky. And of course, that's a really important societal commitment. But we're also saying that a learning healthcare system should be mindful of who's sort of the worst off in terms of their healthcare, or whose problems have not been as consistently addressed. And as they set their priorities for learning for a year, have that be a consideration as well as they think through their priorities. We also say that it actually should be an ethical obligation for healthcare systems, and we don't just mean a healthcare system like Michigan or Hopkins. We mean all the people involved in the healthcare enterprise. So that could be the insurance company, it can be the public system, the private system, to participate in some form of continuous learning. That there's a lot of players who have healthcare data, there's a lot of players who interact with patients, and it's really important to have this shared commitment to learning. Obligation 7 is one of the newer ones that we just sort of hinted at in the paper, but we've now published work since then that is much more explicit about it, that there must be a piece of the system that is devoted to putting in place what is learned. Chuck and I were talking about this earlier this morning, but I will say in most of my travels, and I get it, like I'm a researcher, I love ideas. I feel like a lot of people involved in this world have tons more excitement and energy for the learning part than the implementation part. It is so cool to create the decision tool. It is so cool to figure out whether medicine A works better than medicine B for certain kinds of people. To then figure out how the doctors in my own system much more consistently prescribe medicine A or use the decision tool is tedious and hard and like management. It's a completely different skill set, and yet without a system that is committed to that, it's like, that was a cool science project, put it in the trash. I mean, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but there's a lot of data out there about typically how long it takes for even a really highly visible publication to turn into a change in practice, and sadly, it's often much more than a decade, if not ignored altogether. And this is one that I will say, since we published this, has been controversial, although I do think that there are pieces of it that are not, maybe we didn't make sufficiently understandable, that patients and families also, we believe, have some responsibility ethically to do their part in participating in continuous learning. I'm going to go through these fast, and again, there'll be Q&A. You can ask me about other parts if you want. So obligation one, respect for patients. Again, there's a long history of this in both clinical ethics and in research ethics. What we wanted to stress within this is that not all decisions have equal moral valence for human beings. So informed consent is really, really important, but it's really, really important for certain kinds of things in particular. And even in clinical care, there's so much that happens in an average encounter that a doctor never, and no one questions this, says, I'm thinking of taking your blood pressure. Is that okay? Let me tell you why I'm doing it, and here's the risks and benefits. I'd like you to step on the scale, and let me go through why I'm thinking it's doing it, and let me go through the risks and benefits. It's now time to send you for your blood work, and I'd now like to go through whether, so my point is, we are already doing an extraordinary amount of triage about what are the times when we need to stop and say, okay, now we're doing something where we need to have a conversation. And our argument is that in learning healthcare, the same needs to be true. And by the way, when we study this, I have, for pieces of my research life, I've had a lot of grants that try to study what patients think about consent, about being told things, about transparency, about patient engagement, all sorts of things like that. And I will say, like with all sorts of things we learn in survey research, it really depends how you ask a question. If you say, would you like to be informed about X? Pretty hard to find anybody who says no. If you start to talk about trade-offs and give people a range of choices of the things they think it's important to talk about, you get a really different set of answers. But our key point is that consent is not a monolithic idea. It's something where we need to be thoughtful about why is it that it's important, and again, get a lot of input. I'm going to move to this. I don't presume that I know the kinds of things that are important to talk to different groups of people about, but we can get that kind of information. And that duties of respect go beyond autonomous decision-making. In a follow-up grant we had from PCORI, we essentially used a line that was something like, in research ethics, we have trained people to put all of their respect eggs in the basket of informed consent. And informed consent is really important, but there are so many ways that we can demonstrate respect to the people in our health system, to the people who, in again, my little utopian world, become our partners in learning, in addition to consent. There's an extraordinary set of lost opportunities with regard to transparency, and I'll get a little bit to this. Respecting clinician judgment. So this is really important. There are reasons we go to doctors and not simply to computer algorithms when we have a medical problem. Clinicians' judgments advance patients' medical welfare and their value interests. It is an opportunity to talk through, well, here's why I'm not sure I want the surgery. The importance of the obligation is not equally stringent in all circumstances. There are places where we know where that will become much more important. There is a tension here because of the body of data that suggests that clinician judgment is sometimes in error, and that sometimes the evidence-based medicine algorithm is more often correct than the clinician judgment. So there's a tension here, but we're very explicit in saying the point of this is not to throw clinician judgment out, and when a particular learning activity removes clinician judgment, that becomes a trigger for whether we need more oversight. Provide each patient with optimal clinical care. Again, there's this general obligation to promote the welfare interests of patients toward the best clinical outcome. And part of, again, the triage question here is if introducing a particular learning activity we think could compromise our confidence that the patient is getting the best clinical care known to be available for whatever is his or her ailment, then that becomes a trigger for the need for more ethics oversight. Avoid imposing non-clinical risks and burdens. Same kind of triage idea. Look at the degree to which a learning activity that is superimposed on top of regular care is explicitly creating for its own learning needs additional burdens for patients, and that would be something that becomes a bit of a trigger for a bit more oversight. I've already talked about this, so I'm going to keep going. Obligation 6, this responsibility to engage in continuous learning. This is obviously, healthcare institutions are uniquely situated to be able to further this goal of improving the quality, efficiency, and value of healthcare. It is relevant to their overall mission and responsibility to help the people who come in. And ultimately, if they sort of forego this extra responsibility of learning more systematically, they have lost an opportunity that's hard for others to replicate. So this added one, which to us was a bit implicit, but we're trying to make it far more explicit now, is what we're calling accountability. And it really is the other half of that integration continuous set of arrows. It is, again, not just the generation of insights from data, but it is using the insights and having a system, again, whether it is sort of the Department of Radiation Oncology at Johns Hopkins or the stuff that Peter Margolis is going to talk about when he's here in March. He's done spectacular work with this. How you can have the people sort of with authority in charge of a system say, okay, we have to learn how we're doing with whether it's patient reminders or how we manage people who are not taking their meds regularly, or how we, you know, whatever it is, whether or not people are getting their vaccinations or which meds people get. We need to measure this systematically. And I promise that when we learn that, if it's with all the things that go into validity and credible outcomes, we're going to change the way we do care here afterwards. And there sort of needs to be somebody, it doesn't have to be the same person literally doing the implementation as who did the learning, but there has to be somebody who's sort of authorizing all of this with a commitment to the second part. Because again, I've written so many research grants too that say, I want to do this because X could happen. But like, it sort of doesn't happen most of the time. Healthcare systems must fulfill their promises to patients that the learning was built into the DNA of the system in order to improve care, and then the care was improved. Asking patients and providers to automatically participate in certain activities can only be justified. And I will say, actually, I think this does work pretty well with quality improvement, but I don't think we've done this well in what we've traditionally called research. Asking patients and providers to have their data sort of swept into large-scale analyses, so we're learning about where things are working, where they aren't, who's having falls, who's taking their meds. It's justifiable, in my view, I will make the claim, to do that kind of sweeping and learning if we intervene and next year we have fewer falls, fewer infections, all these kinds of things, and not if it was simply an interesting thing to learn. And then the last one, which, as I've said, has had a little bit of, we've had some pushback, but I would love to engage anyone who wants to push back and have a conversation, that I really have come to believe, and I think our whole team came to believe, that patients do have an obligation to participate in some learning activities, the same way sort of most of our systems have come to a conclusion that we don't get individual consent for quality improvement. For activities that do not change patients' care, and where we have a commitment to not only learn from the care, but implement what's learned, and therefore by not changing their care, there is no additional risk or burden beyond what they would have received, there is this commitment and a value of common purpose, a value of reciprocity, around which, by the way, and I'll get to this next, and I am about to end, we must be transparent. I actually think we could do a far better job than we do with quality improvement about engagement and transparency. And my goodness, paint it as a selling point for our systems. So, some of the work that we've done since then has really focused on what at least we're calling engagement, transparency, and accountability. And this is essentially saying, let's have some engagement with some key stakeholders that at very least include the clinicians who are caring for people and they know the things that they don't know, and patients who are getting care and are feeling frustrated by the things that their really thoughtful doctors are saying that they don't know, and start to build some priorities for learning together. And by the way, in that discussion, start to say, okay, we could do this kind of project or that kind of project or that kind of project, and which are the ones where you think it's important to have a lot of traditional consent things? Which ones could be disclosure? Which ones should we just be able to go ahead and do as long as we promise to improve care afterwards? And then build the transparency in that even if you don't do consent, there are a lot of ways to communicate to people, not only generally, we are a learning healthcare system, this is what this means. Also to say, for those of you who are really motivated by this stuff, here's a website where we'll list the 14 learning activities that we have going on this year, some of the results, who's involved, newsletters about it, the little TVs in a lot of healthcare environments. There's a lot of ways to both keep underscoring the idea that a system is a learning healthcare system and give examples that are really clear and start to illustrate to people what the heck do you mean by that phrase. And then finally, putting in place a triage process. There will still need to be people, in addition to the people in charge of a learning activity, who help to figure out, but sometimes by giving categories so that every single project doesn't need to come. Here's the kinds of things that we think, particularly if there is some transparency around it, do not need to come for additional ethics oversight. Go forward, God bless. And here are other things that we think are starting to a little bit push against the respectfulness, the choice, the burden, the riskiness, the clinical judgment, where we think a little bit more needs to be put in place. That's not one monolithic thing, but there are some other things that start to come into play. Okay, I will end there. Really eager to hear your reactions. Thank you.
So the first question is, how do we address the patient's responsibility to participate in light of multiple barriers and social factors that mitigate or discourage participation? How do we ensure that those who participate are diverse and representative of the population we serve?
Great. So my view would be that, so I want to break the question into sort of two categories of learning activities. There are learning activities where everybody of a particular definition, all kids with asthma who come to a particular clinic, or all people over a certain age in a general medicine clinic, would be included in something that is trying to measure something that already exists, or measure the medication error system, doing something where the target could be sort of everybody, and you're either measuring something that already exists where there's no change to care, or where the change to care is like the medication error duplication reduction system. There's really a lot of reason to believe this is in everybody's best interest. It's not a harmful thing. For things like that, I am arguing that we do not need to get individual consent. And yet we need to be transparent that these things exist. And in that case, everybody who comes is in. And assuming that there is sort of some heterogeneity in who's coming to a particular clinic, everybody's in. There's a different kind of question about how do we get diverse representation in activities where we clearly need to be having individual discussions with people, where it is a different kind of clinical trial and we're going to be saying, hey, here's what it is and I'd like to know. I actually believe that the accountability commitment, which again I think is the weakest link of current practice all over the country, will make the biggest difference in getting more diverse inclusion. Because the truth is, those are the people who are consistently not reaping the benefits of our what should be great American healthcare system. So the more we say, and it's true, that people who come here not only contribute their data, but the care keeps improving, and look at our outcomes compared to lots of other places, and look at our outcomes compared to 5 years ago, and you now have access to that, I think that will be I think that's our most convincing argument. Right now, we say things, and we're doing it in the All of Us research program. We say, people like you, and there's such a goal to have people who've been traditionally underrepresented in biomedical research join the All of Us research program. People like you have been traditionally underrepresented in research, and we want to learn what are health issues, whether medicines work the same way, all sorts of things. And it's a really important commitment, and I really stand by that goal. But this NIH study does not have the power to say, and we then can promise that the benefits of that learning will be as available to you as they are to a lot of other people. A system could do that. And I think that accountability side would be the biggest, I otherwise honestly feel a little awkward about saying to people, we really need to learn about people like you if we can't really guarantee the benefits.
Thank you. All right, the next question is, who should pay for the institution's implementation arm? What about the Benjamins?
So it's an empirical question whether the bottom line of an institution gets better or worse by implementing systematic learning and accountability. And it may depend on the project, right? There are undoubtedly some procedures that certain systems do that are really lucrative that they would learn they could do fewer of, and they'd lose money. But there's also a lot of other kinds of things of preventive care, et cetera, where they would learn things and actually it would really help their bottom line. I mean, my short answer is I think, while assuming the American healthcare system, it seems to me that this is a responsibility of each system until there is some national mandate that says you have to do it. Now, the truth is, this is going to be more attractive, and therefore there are already at the head of the pack if you are the kind of integrated system where people pay more on a capitated basis as opposed to fee for service. Because then you really have an economic incentive to invest in preventive care, to invest in what works, and you lose money with crazy emergency visits as opposed to making money on those. So I do think that, again, it's not coincidental that the Geisingers, the Intermountains, the Kaisers are, Chuck and I were saying this when everybody else is writing on index cards, what a paradox it is that academic medical centers, who are supposed to be distinguished by having people there who want to devote part of their daily work life to learning, are the furthest behind in learning health systems. And it's the groups that are more integrated, whose job is entirely to take care of their patients, and particularly the ones where the patients pay monthly instead of fee for service, who are at the head of the pack. So I do think it's the responsibility of the system, but there's no question that systems, there's no time to do all the projects that people might think up. So they're always going to have to make decisions about which projects they're doing in 2019, which projects they're doing in 2020. And in a fee-for-service system, there will always be incentives to look at projects that could save money. And it's not to say that those will be bad for patient care. My guess is they'll be good for patient care. But it means that there will be a group of projects that are systematically neglected because of their implications. And without going into too much detail, I have heard a few stories that make me wide-eyed of, okay, I'm going to repeat one anecdote. Probably some of you know Earl Steinberg. Maybe, I don't know. He used to be at Hopkins a long time ago. He then worked for Geisinger for a long time. He's one of these, guru, really super smart people who's a clinician, scientist, systems, business. He wears a lot of hats. And he has now become a consultant to health systems that want to be more learning healthcare systems, and both on the database side and the integration side. And he told a story once of some unnamed academic medical center where his goal was to help them do things systematically to reduce, now get this, the number of elective preterm births. Elective preterm births. So they put various things in place, and the place was apparently, this is now becoming urban myth. I've told the story a few times. I really hope it's true. I hope I got it right from Earl. The place was able to reduce the number of elective preterm births from something to a lower number, but it was still not zero. And Earl sort of pushed them, why isn't this better? And apparently there was some pushback that they actually make a lot of money from the NICU. So if that's ever even part of the equation, that's going to really skew the commitment to implementation. So there are we all know there are structural incentives that make certain kinds of behavior more and less likely. I don't feel like it's a lost cause in a fee-for-service environment, but I think we will be systematically emphasizing certain kinds of learnings.
All right, thank you. The next question is around inequalities. There seems to be less emphasis on the obligation to decrease inequalities. What practical steps would you recommend to strengthen these actions and monitor their implementation?
Yeah, great. So the truth is, so in our paper, we frame all of these as an obligation. Having said that, until there is something that's the equivalent of the way quality improvement works, where there's a CDC or a Medicare or a JCO or somebody who is externally seeing the degree to which a system is doing any of these things, it's all going to be internal. It's all going to be internal commitments, internal integrity. So again, there could be, whether it's sort of an entire health system or a unit. I mean, I know at Johns Hopkins, where I work, while there has been a lot of discussion about this, the progress is really happening in pockets of the university, not in the whole thing. And that's like, it's okay. I do think that change often happens that way. But when a particular unit takes on a set of projects saying, we really believe in the mantra of learning healthcare, I think that's the moment for them to consider, it's sort of easy for me to say in my humble opinion, whether they buy into any of this or all of this. And that's a moment for them to say, how are we going to set our priorities? Even in one unit, we can't do all the kinds of learning projects we might want to do. What are the values and obligations that we're going to be guided by? Sort of what's our true north? What's our mission statement here? And that can be a moment to say, every year, at least 25% of our projects are going to be motivated by a commitment to reducing inequities or inequalities in our group, in our patient population, in the kinds of services that we deliver. Right now, there's sort of no accountability or obligation for any of it. I mean, these are all a lot of ideas. We want them to be obligations. It's not like this has been passed by anybody. But we would like for the same kind of commitment to be there to the obligation 5, to the justice one, as there is to the other ones.
Great. So we go to 1:30, right? Okay, we have 2 questions left. Would a single-payer healthcare system make a learning healthcare system more likely?
Yeah. And we know that's right around the corner. It could. I don't want to say it would, but I certainly think it could. Right? So there actually, people who pay the bills have a lot of power to put all sorts of things in place. So even in our current system, I mean, even with my silly little example of I'm allowed to get an eye exam once every 2 years under my personal health insurance policy, people who pay the bills put all sorts of protocols in place. There are all sorts of opportunities and restrictions in healthcare because of particular insurance plans. And they're intended to be evidence-based and fairly well-meaning and all sorts of other things, but ultimately there are rules and restrictions that are put in place by the people who pay the bills. And the same thing certainly would happen with a single-payer system. And then it's a question of which things are also built into the system, and part of it is going to depend on who's in charge of building the system. It would be hard to believe that a system wouldn't be built with some numbers of quality metrics to be monitored in place. And then there's a question of the degree to which a bunch of other things would be put in place. Again, I feel like it's a real opportunity. There are certainly systems that have there are certainly countries that have single-payer systems that are far further along than we are in this. Part of what happens with a single-payer system, which I think is analogous to the places like Geisinger Intermountain, is that when you are paying all the bills, you have even more incentive to figure out what care is working and what care is silly and expensive and doing no good. So I think at very least that particular thing, and you have an interest in getting your patients to show up to their appointments. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you build in, if nothing else, because it's relevant to the bottom line. Assuming that you have, again, I'm going to make an assumption that people have integrity and are not going to entirely shirk the responsibility of providing care to people. Given that, everybody also has to pay attention to how much it costs. And if that motivated you to figure out which of the things you're doing, how often you really have to get the pap smear, how often you really do have to get the mammogram, how often you do have to get the eye exam. I mean, the fact that they're telling me I can only get my eye exam every 2 years unless there's a problem actually does not seem crazy to me. Yes, it's a financial barrier, but it's one that I think, okay, I don't think that actually the well-being of my eye health is being compromised there. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you sort of want built in, and I think you have much more incentive to do if you're paying the bills.
And the last question, you talk about implementation being the key barrier to learning health systems. What elements do you think contribute to that disconnect the most? How does the medical, legal, and risk management system fit in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I hope it's clear from the intro. I'm not a clinician, so what I am saying is as an observer, I'm not a participant observer. I'm an observer, and I know there's a lot of clinicians in the room, and the world I know the best is an academic medical center. So with those caveats in mind, I actually think that there is some push-pull that relate to some of the same human dynamics. So one of the things that I said earlier is that I think for the people who are coming up with a lot of the learning ideas, I genuinely think that there's more intellectual excitement with that. I really believe that the implementation is hard, and I think that there are fewer people who like doing both and have the energy for both. Now, there absolutely are people who love the implementation and appreciate what an extraordinary contribution they're making by taking something that could make such a difference for tens of thousands of patients and making sure it's part of everyday care. But I think that so much energy gets put into the ideas of learning by people who have less interest and commitment to do the second part, that I think that just becomes a challenge. I also think that there are reasons, even separate from the system piece, why, I guess part of what I take from the legal piece of the question is sort of, even separate from a sort of feedback integrated system, why is it that more evidence-based care isn't even practiced, and by some of the legal stuff? So yes, it is absolutely true that there are lots of legal cases out there from people who said you didn't need that test, and then lo and behold, the person had the horrible disease that the test might have detected, and the doctor who didn't order the test was following evidence-based guidelines, and there was this huge there was a huge lawsuit. So it's exactly the same reason why consent forms are 25 pages. You get concerned about the things, you can get sued for the things you don't do. You can get sued for the omissions. I mean, yes, you can get sued for screwing up, but you don't get sued very often for ordering a test that somebody didn't need, assuming there was no obvious harm. So we sort of have all these systematic incentives, and then you couple that with sort of, again, this autonomy personality that so many of us have as professionals. Like, there are people who actually think that guidelines are really cool and they've saved them a lot of time by telling them which tests they need to do, and lots of people believe in that. But there's also some amount of like, well, I really know that it's going to be helpful to get another copy of the scan. And that requires some culture shift.